Okay, so welcome, and now we're going to talk about dot products. Now there are two types of multiplication. We've talked about scalar multiplication, but now there's two other multiplications that we can do with when it comes to vectors, when we're multiplying vectors, which is not the same thing as scalar multiplication. In scalar multiplication, you're multiplying a vector by a real number, okay? But when you're talking about multiplying vectors together, there's the dot product, which we're going to discuss today, and then there's something called a cross product. Now, we're not going to talk about cross products in this class, but in more advanced classes like linear algebra and calculus, we will talk about, or you could talk about, cross products of vectors. Okay? Now, what is a dot product? The dot product of two vectors is this. You take the product of their horizontal components, and you take the product of the vertical components of the two vectors, and you add them together, and that gives you the dot product. And in the dot product, you come up with a scalar. The result is always going to be a scalar. Okay? So let's do that. So let's set this up. So if I have v and u, so here's my two vectors, right? And here's the way they are. They're written in standard position, right? So what does this mean? It means that if I want the dot product, which I represent like this, so when I multiply two vectors together, this is called the dot product, okay, since we're using a dot. And if you want to, again, just for the sake of completeness here, if you want the cross product, typically you might see it using something like that, okay? Or you might see it just with an x, but it's not regular multiplication. It's what we call a cross product, okay? So anyway, back to dot product. Okay, so what is the dot product? That means, for the sake of this example here, it's going to be equal to a times c plus b times d. That is the definition of the dot product of two vectors. Now, you see this angle between the two vectors. So a lot of times you want to know, hey, what's the angle between these two vectors? Okay, let's say we have two opposing forces that are going off in a direction. We want to know, hey, what's the angle between those two opposing forces? Okay? Well, the formula that you would use is going to be this. It's going to be cosine theta is equal to the dot product of the unit vectors to the corresponding vectors. So since we're using v and u, so it would be the dot product of v, the unit vector associated with v, with the unit vector, the unit vector of u. Okay, so that's the formula that you would use to find the angle between the two vectors. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we'll come back and we'll do some examples. Bye.